Thank you all for being here. By increasing the numbers, you've also increased my nervousness. I want to thank TED and CCA for bringing me in. I also do want to acknowledge the Foresight Foundation, who've been hosting me in Nevada City, which has been an extremely deluxe and wonderful residency and lots of fun. I'm also here with the Oakland Museum of California, which is hosting me here to work on an exhibition which will open in September. And so we're working very hard on that, and also part of that is working here with Chronicle Books. So I feel like I'm working with some of the best institutions, and I'm certainly working with some of the best people here in the Bay Area. And I invite you all to join us in some of our activities if you have the energy. I'm going to do something a little bit different maybe for some of you tonight. I'm going to have a slide presentation. Now, slides are, they're these cardboard or plastic mounts. They're about so large, and they have a transparent film in the center, which has an image. Light is projected through that and will appear here, illuminating you. So this might be a new experience for some of you. Don't panic. Everything's going to be fine. And very much like the tradition of slide presentations, like maybe your grandfathers do, or your Uncle Norman in my case, every slide presentation is very much a kind of travelogue. So my slide presentation will also be a bit of a travelogue because, for better or worse, I am very much a globalized artist. So I want to start you off on our travels in the very remote part of Venezuela, in the Venezuelan Amazon territory. Can we have the lights, please? That's one of the things you say when you show slides. Okay, this is a project called On Tropical Nature. It was done in 1992. 1992 being a time when people were thinking a lot about 1492. That's sort of, in some way, the temporal context for this project. I was invited by two organizations in Caracas to do a project. I asked them to establish in each museum 4 empty tables. And for a period of 4 weeks, I traveled in this remote area each week collecting things, very carefully considered things that were placed into a box. That box would go onto my dugout canoe here. We would rendezvous with a speedboat. The box would go in the speedboat to the port, get on a truck, go to the airport, fly across Venezuela to Caracas, get on another truck, go to the museum. And I told them, once you had the box, there'll be some instructions on how to arrange the absolutely marvelous things that are inside. That was a little bit less than true. So when they got the boxes, they were greatly excited about opening them. They opened them, they smelled great, there are great things inside, but there were no instructions. And there's absolute panic. What do we do? How do we show this material? What is this about? What is the narrative structure? What is the meaning behind this material? They had no clue. They just laid things out on the table. By the time the second boxes arrive, they realize, you know what? There are never going to be instructions. And I say, okay, but don't panic. We are museum professionals. And so we know how to deal with these things. We know that round things go with round things. Long things go with long things. So they come up with these kind of formal solutions. And so whatever kind of ecological narrative I had, whatever notion of a portrait of a place or interrelationships between things, that's all kind of tossed out the window for formal museum concerns. So these are some of the kinds of things that go back in these projects. Finally, the last boxes that come back are not so much what I've taken from the jungle, but rather what I took into the jungle. So trying to make it very clear that the real specimen, in a sense, is not the butterflies or the fish and alcohol or the pressed plants, but myself in this kind of guise of the colonial naturalist, kind of reenacting this activity that is highly problematic in a sense. And so taking on that role with a great deal of risk, both conceptually and physically. So this is how they looked in a way. Some years later, I was able to rework that piece, and I tend to rework a lot of pieces pretty much until they don't belong to me anymore. So I feel like I can go back in and rework things. This is This is the way it was reworked after myself and some of the artists around me were looked at very critically and were essentially explained that we were institutional artists who had become institutionalized, as though this was something that happened to us without our knowledge, as if this were not a game that we knew the rules of and that we write the rules of constantly. And we're very, very conscious of the way we use institutions and institutions use us. And this is a very complex dialectic. I work a lot with museums that are not strictly art museums. I try to go out of my way to do that. And in particular, in the earlier work, the first body of work I'm showing you are really things that are really about the consideration of the history of the culture of nature. And so I work a lot with natural history museums. In this case, I was invited by a museum in Switzerland to do a project. While I was invited, I was actually in Brazil doing another project. So I couldn't really respond in the way I might have if I'd been on site. Instead, what I did is I asked them to build an empty vitrine in the middle of their neotropical hall. And while I was traveling in the Amazon, I would observe animals, and whatever I could positively identify, whatever vertebrates, whatever birds, fish, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, I would write them down on a list. That list would go downriver, get to a hotel with a fax machine. They would fax and if the institution had the animal in its collection, it would add it to the vitrine. So I never knew if this was going to be a vitrine which was absolutely bursting or completely empty in a sense. And I like that idea of having that sense of contingency and chance, but not a kind of nonsensical chance, not a kind of Cagean chance or a Dada sense of chance where I'm trying to break form, but rather a chance that really in some way teases out aspects of the acquiring ideology of the institution. You know, the 19th Century Natural History Museum has a great desire. It wants to be Noah's Ark. It wants to have two good examples of everything. But that fantasy is frustrated by a whole number of things, including the, say, for instance, this is Switzerland. It doesn't have the colonial clout that, say, France, Germany, England have. So their collections are not as global. Also, the curators might be, the curators have specific interests. So maybe the curator of insects is more fascinated by crickets than by beetles. So the collection begins to get a little warped in the cricket department, and languishes in the beetle department. So all of these kind of subjective aspects, this is kind of the subjective nature of the museum, change that mission in a way. So here you see there's my fax, and all I have from this list is actually the great Kiskadee. In this case, there's just two birds on the list. And another thing I like about this work is I only know it from these several images. So I only know it in this way. So I've had no kind of physical contact with it. So, okay, so those original boxes from Venezuela, a couple of years later, some of them show up in New York, and they become part of a project in which I create 3 fictional bureaucracies in my gallery. And those bureaucracies are, they're engaged in the business of organizing nature. Each one has a different sensibility, a different methodology. Some are more rigorous, some are more hippie. All of them are bureaucracies, though. So this is the New York State Bureau of Tropical Conservation. And at this time, I'm not thinking about conservation like wildlife conservation, like I would normally think of, but I'm thinking about it as art conservation. And I used to work as an art conservator. So I open these boxes, and every twig, every leaf, every severed butterfly wing or fish in alcohol comes out and is carefully wrapped in glassine, is sanitized, is cataloged, and then placed onto the shelf where it can, in some future day, maybe, be recovered. But that process of processing these treasures also takes them off view. So you can't really see them anymore. All you see is the collection constituted, stored, but no longer accessible. And you see this incredibly virile, handsome man who is going through the process of organizing this material at one part during the day. So I would jump between these 3 bureaucracies. So I'd spend 2 hours in one, a couple hours in the other, a couple more hours in the third one. And then when the piece is finished, when I've done my job as a sculptor to constitute a collection, I close the bureau. So, and then it exists largely as a sculpture, with the collection, the costume, the empty boxes, and each one also had a door. And I think about them a lot as period pieces. And so the door is a clue to that. So they all involved sort of expeditions, but not all the expeditions were remote, faraway places. So this was an expedition of walking over about 6 blocks to New York City's Chinatown, where for 4 hours I collected every fresh sea creature I could find. Those were taken to the gallery and put onto ice. And the methodology behind this particular project was orthodox taxonomy, was looking at those specimens and figuring out what was their true scientific name, identifying everything. You might guess that there was a little bit of urgency behind this particular bureau, so I had to work very fast to actually find out what these things were. Once something was identified, it was put in a preservative and placed onto a shelf. Now, what's important about this is extremely hard, even for people who know what they're doing. And so here I am really trying desperately to learn the methodology, and I'm not an ichthyologist in the same way that I'm not a botanist and I'm not an ornithologist. I'm a passionate amateur about a lot of things, and in some way a classic dilettante. And so I'm trying to go through this process of keying things out. Now that's also very difficult because Chinatown is a very international market. So, one of the ways you find out what kind of octopus you have is to know where it came from. If it came from the Mediterranean, if it came from the Pacific, if it came from the Atlantic. You don't know that when you buy something in Chinatown, and usually they don't know it either. So it's really hard to, so the success rate was not 100%. And this is not about taking on, in a very cozy way, the mastery of science. It's not about taking on the language of the master in our society. It's really about kind of fumbling. It's a little bit about, it's about punching over your weight. You're really trying, you're struggling with something. And I think I gained a lot of respect for people who actually properly do this by doing this project. And this is it. It was the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the City of New York, the Chinatown Division. And I'm also very pleased to say that years later, I was able to do a project called the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the City of San Francisco, the Chinatown Division, which used the same methodology with Chinatown here that was shown at the Yerba Buena Center. And I think that was, for me, that's a really interesting thing to do, is to try the exact same project in 2 very different places and to see what the differences are, to see how much that context change really changes the meaning. A lot of my interests also revolve around specific people, characters who I think about as linchpin figures in the history of natural history. I think there are people who really help to drastically reshape our definition of nature, what nature means to a very broad public. I think that would include, of course, people like Aristotle. That would include people like Rachel Carson, like Darwin, like Alfred Russel Wallace, like Jacques Cousteau and David Attenborough. And this is a person who was like that for the early part of the 20th century. His name is William Beebe. Beebe was he was a scientist. He was an ornithologist for the New York Zoological Society. He also was a passionate writer. He wrote 23 what we'd call bestseller books now. He wrote for The New Yorker, and he really was one of the people who introduced the modern biology to a general public in the United States. He did radio programs. He was an enormous celebrity in his lifetime. And one of the interesting things about Beebe is that he was one of the first American biologists who really believed that if your field was biology, the science of life, maybe working in the basement of the Natural History Museum with dead things was not the best way to do that. That it was really, he really integrated the ecological thinking into his practice and took the laboratory to the field. So he did oceanographic work in the Bahamas, in Trinidad, and he did he established some of the first tropical research stations. In this case, this is a photo from 1917, just after the First World War. He goes to Guyana, and it's such an amazingly interesting character and powerful character for the time. And he writes a funny story where he is about to leave. He's coming back to New York, and he's about to get on his steamer ship at the mouth of the Amazon in Belém, and he measures out a square meter of leaf litter, and he puts that into his duffel bag. And then he gets to his cabin on the steamer ship, and he empties it on the table, and he spends the entire trip back going through it to see what's actually here. So separating out all the leaves, finding all the microfauna, all the bird feathers, whatever is in this, separating out and constituting this incredible collection of just 1 meter, which really leads him to believe, of course, by the time he gets to New York, the small things he finds are just so numerous and so different and have not been described by science. It's the first indication that this idea of biodiversity is a tropical phenomenon, something really happening in the tropics. So for the Rio Earth Summit, I was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art in Rio to do a project, and that is really the moment where this term biodiversity enters into public conversation. Before that, it's really just a kind of obscure scientific word. Now everyone has some sense of what that means. So I wanted to redo Beebe's experiment and also to combine that with another story that Beebe tells called My Jungle Table, in which he has his assistant build him a table in the forest where he can work and do his dissections and things like that. And whenever he does that, the ants crawl up the table and start eating his specimens. So he's very frustrated with this. And then he puts the legs of the table in coffee cans of water, and the ants can't cross over the water. But that causes the table to sprout. And so the table begins to grow around him, and then there are wood-boring beetles in the table, and they're knocking to each other, and there's spiders spinning their webs in the table, and there are birds swooping down and eating the spider. And that kind of idea of you trying to separate something out of the system, and the system kind of overwhelmingly coming back on you. So for the first 10 days, I don't know what the registrars for this museum are thinking, but I was able to bring this meter from the Amazon into Rio and go through it trying to separate things out. And so this, again, was a very public event, and it had a very strong level of participation. The art audience in Brazil were very engaged. They don't have that kind of holy separation with the art object, this no-touch thing, so they're engaged, sometimes impossibly engaged. So it would be quite difficult to get things done during the day. So this started for me a whole series of I think, really rich for me entomological endeavors. So this is taking that similar methodology to Switzerland, working with the really famous, great, maybe notorious curator Michel Ritter in Freiburg, measuring out a square meter of meadow, building a laboratory inside of his museum, and bringing that meter there, and turning that laboratory really into a lens, in a sense. So the viewers come and they look into this other world, which is the world of scientific inquiry, where, again, this specimen is preparing, using this Zeiss microscope, all of the things that are inside of that. So all of the microorganisms, finding them, photographing them, beginning with specimen number 1, the first thing you find, going to specimen number 2. Each time the camera is refocusing, the backgrounds are done differently. So you have this enormous collection of organisms. We took as many photographs as we could without breaking the budget of the photo department there, and that was how we knew when to stop, when the budget operator said, okay, that's enough. The scale is very different on these. So, for instance, an organism like this is actually living on an organism like that. So they don't have the usual conventions that would make them normally of scientific purpose, in a sense. They don't have the same scale. They don't have a unified background. They're not in a taxonomic order. They're really just in the order that they were found. Working in Munich on a project called the Great Munich Bug Hunt, We found a linden tree, which had been dead outside of the town for about 5 years. We brought it into the very chic gallery district in Munich. And there, working with students from the graduate students from the Zoological Institute, we did a kind of CSI investigation on this tree, peeling back layer after layer, finding the things that are living in, on, and around the tree. An important part of this, of course, is that trees like this, for an economic forest, like is what you mostly have in Germany, you don't really have true forests, you have massive tree farms, so they value forestry in a very different way. They're looking for the economic value of the forestry. They're not looking for the ecological value. So a dead tree is very much a useless thing in terms of the economy. In fact, it breeds the animals that will infect the other forests, things like wood-eating beetles and things like that, and fungi. On the other hand, ecologically speaking, of course, you couldn't have something more ecologically productive than a dead tree. So all of the things were processed in our laboratory and then carefully placed in a cabinet that we prepared for that. So starting again with the first specimens we find, working our way through the fungi, through the mold, through the mosses, through the lichens, through the arthropods and the worms and other invertebrates, filling all of these vials until we have this very kind of antiseptic collection that represents the life in, on, and around that tree. Numbering in the hundreds, of course. At this point, I realized there's a fundamental flaw with this methodology of always bringing nature into the museum, and maybe it's already there. So in Chicago, we closed down the Smart Museum of Art. Hillary, that's you, I think, isn't it? Yeah. So with a team of very dedicated volunteers, we did this entomological sweep of the Smart Museum, starting in the storage units and working our way up to the offices. Perhaps it's not surprising that not a single living thing was found in the office of the registrar, whereas the director's office was teeming with life. And so, again, for the first couple days of the project, I worked with the microscope technician, working on the finds, photographing them, and then beginning this wall of the representations of the organisms. Whoa, what happened there? Let's try that again. All right. This is my platonic self who stands in for me when I'm not around. So, there was also a catalog of which organisms came from which sites, as though this would have some sort of meaning. You'd be surprised how many spiders can be on a Tony Smith sculpture, for example. Okay. So at a certain point in my, that's part one. At a certain point in my work, I really became like the natural history guy. And so every exhibition about green art, about animals in art, art and ecology, art and natural history, I was invited to. And it was very difficult for me to do things other than that. When I suggested doing another kind of project, I would often be stopped, and people weren't interested in doing those kind of projects. So I thought, this is incredible, this is really cramping my style, boxing me in. I needed some way to throw the hounds off my trail, in a sense. And I thought, well, what's really important for me about this is not so much a specific relationship to zoology, even though that is something I love, but rather what is maybe my artistic contribution is this notion of shadowing a methodology, of borrowing a method from an entirely distinct field, using aspects of that scientific method, but not following through with the same results. So another thing I've always been quite interested in, and again in a very amateur fashion, is archaeology. So I started the whole series of archaeological endeavors. I apologize to the 9 students who helped me this weekend because I'm going to show some of the slides I showed to them. But I'm going to start in Freiburg, Switzerland. This is a group of houses that were built in the 17th and 18th century. We're looking at the back of the houses. The front of the houses face the town square, and the back of these houses are on this precipice that goes into the river. People have been doing, since these houses were built, people have been doing what people always do when they live up high. They've been dropping things out their window. Things have been falling out the window. Children have been throwing things out the window. And so the curator and I took as much of the material from the bottom of the gorge as we could, and we brought it in wheelbarrows across the town into the gallery and dumped it on the floor. And then we spent the first 10 days of the exhibition going through and removing and carefully preparing all of the material culture that was in this raw material, this pile of dirt. We built a shelf around the gallery space, and each object was placed on the shelf not in the way you would find it possibly in an archaeological collection. So I'm not telling you about the evolution of a technology, the development of a style, about things in a chronology. What I'm doing is showing you this is the first thing I found, this is the second thing I found, and in a way trying very much to approximate this notion of the simultaneity of history. And that's really what is interesting to me, that when I walk out into a European street, when I walk out into that courtyard in Freiburg, I'm looking at a 14th century cathedral, and next to that is a 17th century town hall. Next to that is a 19th century townhouse, but it has a brand new McDonald's in the basement. And that kind of idea of seeing it all at once, of history existing all at once, as a kind of a simultaneous situation, and also a kind of notion of a continuity, in a sense, that one thing doesn't replace another, and one thing is built on top, very much like the kind of stratification that archaeologists are interested in. So here you have a early 20th century marmalade pot, a 19th century wine bottleneck, a very contemporary licorice container, some 18th century Dutch oven parts, and a 19th century shoe heel. So that kind of sense of history. Another one of these projects was done, whoops, sorry about that. Trying to get the focus there. There we go. This is, of course, the city of Venice, a city that has waterways, canals, but not really roads. And Venice, of course, is a city of great beauty, great history and art and architecture, a great city of romance and intrigue, and a city of very disgusting mud, which is at the bottom of these canals. Because everything has to go by boat traffic, it's very expensive to throw your trash away in Venice. So if your washing machine breaks down, and in the middle of the night, if it should find its way onto the sidewalk and get a little too close to the canal, you've solved yourself a great expense. And this stuff builds up in the canal and creates a situation which is very dangerous for the boat traffic. Of course, the mud is also moving in the canals at a much slower rate than the water, but it is moving. So the city has a fleet of barges. These barges dredge the canal, and they take the material from the bottom of the canal, they put it in the center of the boat, and they take it out to the lagoon and dump it. And this process goes on, dozens of times every day. So, in 1997, Mariko Mori and I were invited to be the guests of the Nordic Pavilion, because Mariko and I are the Nordic ideal. And we were, so I did a 3-part project using this incredibly, almost mythologically rich material, rich both in stories and also in artifacts. The first part was to build something about the size of one of the central barge containers, and to take the contents of one of those barges and put it on display outside of the pavilion. This did not make us friends with our neighboring pavilions, I can promise you that. And this is the material. It is everything they say. It's full of human waste. It's very oily. It's anaerobic. It does have an interesting, very kind of pared down ecology, but a really interesting ecology of mole shrimps and worms and other kind of invertebrates. But it is also incredibly archaeologically rich. You couldn't stick a pencil into this without hitting something. And so I wanted to know what that something was. So I spent the entire summer, or almost the entire summer, cleaning this material, going through it and finding what was inside of this. So I built in their storage unit a kind of treasure trove. I'm very interested, of course, in how the curiosity cabinet of the 19th century develops into the treasure trove, or develops into the Enlightenment Museum that we're all familiar with. But also before that happens, you have the treasure trove of the Middle Ages that develops into the Curiosity Cabinet. Something drastic happens between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance where they realize that, in the Middle Ages you take your treasure and you hide it in the deepest dungeon or the highest tower. And in the Renaissance they realize, no, wait a minute, I'm showing my treasure. This is bling bling. My treasure shows to the world my global influence, my erudition, my ability to command riches. And so this is something that kind of exists in between these two. It is very much in the dungeon, in the storage closet. At the same time, it's showing all of these. This is my equivalent to the alligator hanging from the ceiling, maybe. And again, I'm trying to show these things in a way that you would never encounter them in a history museum or an archaeology museum. I'm trying to take an almost naive interest in them, like a childhood collection, as though I don't know what they're for, as though I am really that visitor from Mars who's confronted with human material culture and is not entirely sure how things go together. Maybe they go together by very superficial resemblances, in a sense. The canal I dug was called Rio da Sensa, was behind the hospital. So we've got all these beautiful little jars that are actually serum jars from the hospital. So there were lots of charming discoveries like that throughout the course of the event. And of course we found lots and lots of ceramics. Venice is not an old city by Italian standards at all. It's kind of the Las Vegas of the early modern period. It was always an entertainment center, but it wasn't really a strategic important center in trade or had a military function during the Roman period. We did find enormous numbers of ceramic artifacts showing import ceramics, of course, local ceramic production, glass production, and even some of the production of African ceramics entering into Europe. The final stage of this, as I said, there are 3 stages in many of these projects, is actually the laboratory itself. So showing the studio, the lab, the space in which objects are cleaned and sorted. So there are objects still embedded in the mud. There are objects that are coming out, they're being cleaned. You can see the rudiments of categories taking shape, and you can see all of the equipment of the activity itself. I found lots and lots of things. Literally everything here that was found by me. There's no assistance on this project. This was by far the most miserable summer of my life. I recommend all artists keep up on your hepatitis shots. One of the other projects was called the Tate Thames Dig, was done in the city of London. The Thames River, of course, dividing the city. When I did this project, there were 2 Tate galleries. There was what is now called the Tate Britain, which was then called the Tate Gallery, and the Tate Modern, which this was done a year before the Tate Modern opened. One is at Millbank, one is at Bankside. These are 2 areas that have dramatically different social histories to them. And I bet that those social histories were represented by the material artifacts that existed here on the foreshore. The Thames is a very strong river. It's a tidal river, so it changes twice a day. It goes out and comes in twice a day. This area that everyone's sitting here is called the foreshore. The foreshore is visible, and you can walk on it for about 4 hours a day. The foreshore is also insanely rich in archaeological treasures, treasures is a relative term, I hope. And each time the river goes back and forth, it's like a new roll of the dice, what you might find there. It changes entirely. And that's one of the things that makes the Thames not a very interesting place for archaeologists. The context is destroyed. So there's no real context for an archaeological dig. All of the projects I work with are places that have been compromised in a sense. They are what archaeologists term insignificant and disturbed, which I think is a nice title for all of my archaeological works, perhaps. And so I worked with an incredible team of people who were either under 17 or over 65, so what British would call pensioners and teenagers. Each day, we did 5 days at each of the sites. We identified an area, we kind of roped it off, and we would say, okay, in this spot, we are to collect all of the material culture, all human-made things. And that in itself is a challenge for some people, that determine what's human-made and what's not. I worked with an amazing team of project coordinators. This is the artist Lenka Clayton and Naomi Beckwith, both of which are very established people now. Naomi is the curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Lenka is a documentary filmmaker and artist as well. This is Hamsini and Alexis, two people who had this incredible ability to find things. You know, archaeologists often talk about having a search image, the thing you keep in the back of your mind, the image you keep in the back of your mind that helps you find things. It's like when people are going down the beach and they're looking for shells. Some people will come back with 100 shells and some people will come back with 2 shells. These are the 100-shell people. They really had this incredible ability to find things like needles and pins from the London Bridge, which collapsed into the river, was the center of the needle, pin, wire, and nail trade. And so they were pulling out needles from the foreshore. And just, you know, some people just have this incredible ability to find things. This is the team on any particular day. So a really dynamic group. I think that this was a lot of fun for them. And again, this is a project which has 3 stages. So the first stage is only public by chance. You know, the public really are the participants. People can come by and see the event, and we certainly would talk to them, but it's not something we advertise as a public event. We're not on display in a sense. The second stage was very much, we were on display. This is the lawn of the Tate Gallery, and we built these 3 Indiana Jones-style tents. The two of the tents, one tent had all of the finds from Bankside, the other tent all the finds from Millbank. The third tent was used as a kind of seminar space. We also hosted every day different lecturers, people who had a very concrete relationship with the river, like the Thames Police Force or the harbor master. Also, art historians, archaeologists would come by and talk to us. Every single object, and when I say we found hundreds of thousands of things, that is certainly not an exaggeration, would come out of these tents, would be cleaned, and then carefully we would go through a process of categorizing those things, of putting them into increasingly refined categories. So first you clean all the glass, then you divide it into brown glass, blue glass, clear glass, etc. Then glass that has writing in it. Then bottlenecks versus bottle bottoms, and et cetera, until you've really refined this collection. We had this tape across, and we said, but anyone except an obvious lunatic was allowed to come behind the tape and treat us very much like the Antiques Roadshow. And so people were allowed to come in and snoop around in the tents, looking at the materials, seeing that process of refinement which was continually going on. This is, for instance, the bones. We're going to need the next carousel right about now. There's only 17 more to go, so. You don't watch Mad Men. Okay, so as I said, every single thing had to be cleaned, and it's very difficult getting teenagers to wash dishes sometimes, especially for the entire summer. This is how things were stored until we could sort them through. And then on the next stage, a very large double-sided cabinet is designed and built, and this holds really 90% or 99% of all the things that we found. So there was a shopping cart, there are a couple tires, there's a dead dog that didn't make it into the case, but otherwise, this is really everything. And I think what's interesting about that is also that it's very, going through this stuff, it's very complex. There's layer after layer of things. So just because there's one layer that you can see in front, there's always things in back. There are things in the cupboards underneath. There are things in top. Of course, a double-sided cabinet implies that I'm demonstrating a comparison, that there's a comparison between Millbank and Bankside that's going to tell you something about their history based on their material culture. but I don't deliver on that because I don't show the same things on the two sides of the cabinet. I show entirely different things on both sides of the cabinet. So that desire to kind of frustrate, that desire to find a specific kind of meaning in this is constantly shifted on you. And also, there are a lot of things that break those rules about finding material culture. A lot of the students couldn't tell the difference between, say, pieces of flint and something that was human-made. So there are bits of flint inside there. There are objects there are fossils. There are things that are these very exciting hybrids that are natural things or man-made things that nature has somehow enacted upon. There's also a section which shows that how well or how particularly this is curated, because I can't show you every coin we found. I can't show you every human tooth. I can't show you every credit card, every cell phone, every bit of human hair, all of these kinds of things. Not everything we have room to really display. Like the visual cabinets of the 18th century, it has a somewhat interactive element. You can pull out these drawers, and even in the drawers, which are spectacularly full, there might be a different system in each drawer. So one drawer, there might be things that are related because of their material. They might be all plastic, or they might be all glass, or they might be all ceramic. The next drawer, things might be grouped together based on their utility. The next drawer, it might be they're grouped together and arranged by the color spectrum. So that idea of trying to find a sense to this thing, it's constantly jumping as you try to assess it. It's always jumping out of your ability to comprehend in a certain way. It really is essentially what it really is a catalog, a kind of compendium, a kind of encyclopedia of methods of collecting and displaying, of methods of arranging things. This is our kind of greatest hits drawer, which has a wonderful sea urchin test. So when people say, "What's the oldest thing you found?" You say, well, 400 million years. And, there's a voodoo doll, and there's bullets from the Second World War, and there's teeth from the bear baiting pits, which, Bankside was always the place that where you could do things that you couldn't do in the city of London proper. So that's where the bear baiting, the whoring, the drinking, the theater all went on in Bankside during the Renaissance. And 16th century ceramics, et cetera, shoes from children from the 19th century. And then the last section are really photographs of all of the people who worked on the project. So not just the volunteers who did the digging, but also things like the Tate publicity staff and the film crew and the project manager and the curator. So in a way, trying to run the credits on the project. Like this is how many people it takes to do something like this. Whew. Okay, so that was what, part two? Yeah, that was part two. Part three, I want to talk a little bit about public art, which is a very problematic category. I think public art is probably the arena of art which has the greatest aesthetic and moral crimes. So I'm always looking for a good model for public art. And what the hell is it for, And I understand commemorative art, that someone did something great, you put them on a pedestal. And I understand cemeteries, that cemeteries can be great sculpture parks. And I think a great cemetery like Gettysburg or something like that, or Auburn in Boston, or the one, what's it called, in Philadelphia, those are amazing. Also, another model I'm really keen on, although not necessarily keen on the way it originally was formed, was this idea of the folly, this idea from the 18th and 19th century aristocrats creating architectural structures which do not have a function other than a discursive function. So they're not meant to be barns, they're not meant to house people, they're meant to generate meaning and create situations. And I think that's a very interesting model in a sense. And it's a model which I think maybe Disneyland is a good example of. But I kind of understand that as architecture, sculpture. And so I want to do a whole series of these. This is the first one I did with Bob Brain and J. Morgan Pewitt right here in the front row. And we did a collaboration called the Schoharie Creek Field Station, which was in Lexington, New York. And this is a project in which we're very interested in the vernacular of the Catskills naturalists, people like John Burroughs, who greatly influenced the next generation of the aesthetic of the Park Service and things like that, who are really interesting naturalists. And so we developed a structure. We did an adaptive reuse of a building. The way that you would see this piece is that you would write the organization, and they would send you the key. And then you would open the space up and go inside, and inside were all of these materials that you could spend time there. It looked very much like a kind of Catskills residence. Yet at the same time, there was very contemporary biological equipment there. So you could do dissolved oxygen tests in the river. It's on the Schoharie Creek, which was once a very prominent trout fishing creek, which in the 19th century and the early 20th century was polluted, so the trout have still not come back. So you can do tests on the water quality, on the toxicity. You can sample the invertebrates, which give you an idea of that. There are microscopes in there. There's all this kind of stuff, but it still has this quite 19th century flavor. There's a bed that suggests maybe your stay not be too long. But you literally can go there for an hour. You can go there for the weekend. You can go there for any period of time. And we've designed it so it looks very homey. So there's a picture of the grandfather in the back. Of course, it's not the grandfather. It's Charles Darwin. And the picture of this kind of chubby guy smiling with the fish, that's actually Hemingway. And the woman below is Fly Real Crosby, the woman who popularized fly fishing in the United States. So that really, I started to think very much about using that model of vernacular architecture as a kind of interesting way of solving this problem of how to work as an installation artist, an artist who really believes in the kinds of things you can say with the complexity of installation, yet at the same time working in outside. You can't really do that with public art. It's about sculpture. It's about a thing that you plop somewhere. And so I thought, well, maybe not. So I was commissioned to do a gateway for a small nature reserve in the Netherlands, or it's on the border of Germany and the Netherlands. And so you enter into this preserved peat bog between these two houses. A lot of my work starts with these very simple blue and red cartoony drawings. That really is how I communicate to the people who are making my work, which it's rarely me actually doing it anymore, what I want, in a sense, the flavor of what I want. And so this is the building that we came up with using, again, the local style, the local materials. This is it the first day. So, one of the great models in public art, of course, is the ruin, because the ruin is the only thing that gets better as it gets worse. So, they can graffiti this, they can burn it, whatever. It's just going to get better. So, but a way that you encounter this piece, again, as I said, as a sculptural work, as an architectural work, but also you look through the windows. And there you encounter this kind of construction of a character who has a very particular relationship with the land, who has a kind of knowledge of the land which is very, very different from a contemporary sense of research, say. That it's a very active, some might say very aggressive relationship of the hunter, of a person who sees themselves as very much, or imagine themselves as very much part of a continuity of nature. Of course, in these things, there are always rewards for careful viewers. So there are lots of photographs of hunters and their prey, but if you look carefully, they're actually all celebrity hunters. So there's like pictures of Kirk Douglas and all the things he killed in Africa, and pictures of Ted Nugent and something he killed, and these kind of very funny things. Its companion building is a contemporary biological field station. So again, built in the way that it would be built in this place. And you experience this very much by looking through the windows and seeing inside everything one might need to study the ecology of the site. So, there are sampling nets and there are shovels but again, there are these clues that maybe this is less. It's not what it seems to be. So there are sinks without water. There's computers without electricity. There are clocks that don't work. There are phones without phone lines. So enough things to kind of reward the careful viewer into knowing that not everything is as it seems. At this point, my friends at the Galerie für Landschaftskunst in Hamburg, who's a gallery devoted to artists who work with landscape issues and have very close relationships with people in the scientific community, they said, so why is it always fake with you? Why can't you do something real? Why can't you do something that works, that functions, in a sense? And so I said, well, let's try something. So we worked, the city of Hamburg lent us a barge, and Hamburg, as any Hamburger will tell you, has more miles of canals than Venice does, and they're very proud of their canals. So we built a laboratory onto this, which functioned as a kind of public space. It functioned as a conference space. There was a group of soil scientists who used this. It worked as a field laboratory for botanists who were doing samples of diatoms and other things that were in the river or in the canals. And it would travel about the city. And also we taught, it was a great classroom space, so we did nature illustration classes on the weekends. And it would travel to different sites. And as we were going, we had a program of things that we wanted to do and these kind of interactions we wanted to have. This is a great place for watching the sunset and having a drink also. And people would come to us like the scuba diving clubs. Oh, could we have the ship and the Ulster so we can do this dive we wanted to do? And we said, yeah, okay. And artists came and they said, I want to do these drawing machines, these that float in the water next to the barge, and the waves will make the drawings. And we said, okay, no problem. This woman came, she wanted to read the Odyssey by firelight. And we said, why not? And people wanted to have a rave, and we said no. But otherwise, it really did work as this kind of platform for a wide variety of activities. This is the inside. And because we worked very closely with the university, we also got a lot of cool scientific toys. So we could do sampling, we could do water testing, we could do a whole variety of things. That's Till Krauser, who's an amazing artist and the director of the Gallery for Landschaftskunst. Okay, you're all still here, so I'm guessing we're okay. We are beginning to come down the home stretch, so don't fret, don't leave yet. So this is a project that was done at the Tijuana Estuary, which of course is the park that's on the border between the United States and Mexico. In Tijuana, this was done for what's it called? This project in Insight, right? So a large exhibition of site-specific projects on both sides of the border. This is an interesting place. This park was preserved. Underneath the park is a landfill, so that's why it was never developed, even though it's on beautiful beachfront. So it has the ocean in front of it. Also, during the Second World War, this is where the Navy tested their bombing and firing munitions. So, and the Navy still has the adjacent property, which they use to test their helicopter pilots. So at no time can you be here without 1 to 4 helicopters overhead, sometimes with Navy SEALs dangling from them. It's also attached to sprawling suburbs. So there's all the kids who want to ride their BMX bikes in the park. There's the Park Service who are chasing those kids. And it is, remember, on the border. So there are illegal aliens trying to cross over, and then there's the Immigration and Naturalization Service trying to chase them. So this is a place with an incredible long history of mischief, in a sense, and I wanted to build a building that had that vernacular of mischief to it. So I built this strange camouflage structure, and it's situated on this beautiful bomb crater, which is an amazing draw to the local wildlife. So this is not the most restful nature preserve you've ever heard of, but if you're a fish that needs to swim upriver, that Tijuana River, even though it's one of the most polluted in the country, that's your best shot. And miles on both sides of the border. If you're, garbage-eating raccoon, this is probably where you spend the night. If you're a bird who needs to put its nest on the sand, this is your best shot. So all this wildlife is kind of funneled into this place. How you see this piece is you go to the Park Service, you give them your license, they hand you a key, you walk out 3 miles. So none of our friends from New York saw this work. And then you open the building up, and instead of finding mischief, what you find is this incredible mecca for birdwatchers. So this is a kind of birder's paradise. There's books on birding. There's lists. Birders love lists. There's recording equipment. There's lots and lots of optics. There's information about all the local birds. There's a frieze of the 40-something birds that you can see there all year round. They look like the triumph of nature photography, but in fact they're all dead birds from museum dioramas. And there are tons and tons of spotting scopes. As I said, it's on this bomb crater, which is full of water, which is very, very rich with migratory birds. There's a kind of hall of fame of people who have made great contributions to bird life, including Roger Tory Peterson, Marjorie Stoneham Douglas, Rachel Carson. There's a instruction guide in case you want to build a bird. There's some x-rays of birds who have run into problems with people. So it is this kind of great mecca for bird watchers. Now, my friends in New York at the Public Art Fund were very jealous of this. So they wanted to do an equivalent that was at Madison Square Park, which is the park on 23rd Street across from the Flatiron Building, where they've done a lot of public art programming. This park has probably the biodiversity of your parking lot here. And so I manned that with a very charming guy who's a very prominent DJ, very smart guy, but it's probably the most ignorant person of the natural world I've ever met. And so he couldn't really tell you anything if you came up there. But nevertheless, he would greet you, and he would try to encourage you to come into this space, a piece that really tries to summarize my life in a way that you go to this junk store and look through the windows, and it's everything you've ever wanted to own, and you try to get in, and the door's locked, and there's no indication that anyone will ever be back anytime soon. And so, again, you encounter the piece, and it's about creating a certain kind of frustration, a kind of frustration with those who need to acquire things. And so you look inside, and it's just jam-packed with amazing things. But of course, it's not just random. So there are several shelf units. One shelf unit is organized around the allegory of the seasons. Another shelf is organized around the allegory of the humors. Another is organized around the allegory of the ages of man. So everything is very specifically put in relationship to other things, and that they're very careful catalogs of how things are put together. It's not just randomly, and I'm just not randomly throwing things in there. It's extremely carefully curated, the objects, in relationship to each other. In this case, this is a project done outside of Vienna for Schloss Graveneck, Castle Graveneck, which is a very curious castle that was a medieval castle, but in the 19th century, the person who owned the castle thought that it wasn't really medieval looking enough, so he built a neo-Gothic castle over his Gothic castle. So it's a kind of Disneyland castle, and it's in this incredible French-style garden, so everything is extremely organized. Nature is pruned and manicured, and nature is treated as a kind of object in a sense. So what's left out of that is really this sense of nature as a process which embraces the cycle of life and death and things. So this is a box eider circle that used to surround, was a low hedge that surrounded a fountain. That fountain was hit by lightning in the 19th century. The gardeners, out of perversity, let the hedge grow, so it's grown now to 22 feet high, and it's in a perfect circle. You can go inside, and it's like a room. Unfortunately, the visitors to the castle think that room is maybe the restroom. So I came up with another way of using that. So I built this shattered tower, and you approach the shattered tower through an opening, and then you look through the window, and there's a carefully constructed diorama which really highlights this idea of nature as a process, of really highlights the idea of a death and decay in the forest. So there's our poor little baby. And you look inside, and it's a very kind of tragic scene with all of the decaying organisms around this, and the deer is sprouting mushrooms, and there are maggots, and there are, I'm sorry, the light is not so good. This light is kind of killing my images. And so there it is. So, yeah. Everyone goes quiet with that one. It's the real skin of a deer. Yeah. One of the larger of the projects I've worked on, again, thinking very much about this problem, is called the Seattle Bavarium, or the Newcomb Bavarium now. This is a very large site, a very large purpose-built building. It's a greenhouse which is engaged in taking a tree from the forest and allowing it to decompose. You know, in the rainforest of the Pacific Northwest, you have these incredible phenomena that, of course, like all rainforests, the nutrients are no longer in the ground. They're really bound up in the plants. The plants have a monopoly on the nutrients. When a giant tree, and when people think tree in this part of the world, they think giant. When that tree dies, it releases those nutrients, it releases that energy, it releases those sugars, and that becomes the basis of the next generation of forests. This is called a nurse log. And so these logs exist on the forest floor, and all of the next forest grows up through and around them. And this process happens very fast. When a tree dies, it is very swiftly colonized by other plants. So I wanted to take this phenomena and bring that back to the middle of Seattle. And people are always used to going out to the forest. I wanted to bring an ambassador back from the forest into the center of the city. This was a project that took years to do. I worked with an incredible team of soil scientists, hydrologists, environmental educators, gardeners, just an amazing group of people. It took us about 2 years to find the right tree, which we found in the watershed around Seattle. The national park were very interested in the project, but they said the paperwork to get a tree out of the national park would stretch from Seattle to Washington, D.C. and back. So we had to find a place that was sympathetic, but had a little less red tape. The watersheds have that. We found a tree that had fallen down 2 years before we knew exactly the night it fell. We knew everything about what this tree was. We had the target species were either Douglas fir or western hemlock, which is the state tree. And this is putting it into place. So you see, this is part of the Olympic Sculpture Park, which is part of the Seattle Art Museum. Seattle Art Museum bought this area in the middle of the city, which developers were afraid of because they thought the remediation issues they thought the ground was so toxic that you couldn't possibly afford to build there. The Seattle Art Museum Fund tested it, worked with the people who polluted it to clean it up, found out it wasn't as bad as what they thought, and created this, what I think is the first really interesting urban sculpture park. And this is the vivarium. Every aspect of this building is constructed to recapitulate the systems that exist in the forest to allow this tree to do what it naturally does, and decaying and releasing those nutrients. So you enter through this kind of vestibule, which gives you a lot of information about the tree itself. There is a frieze of some of the really, I think, important and prominent scientists and cultural figures who certainly inform my interest in these issues. There's this panel which also shows the names of some of the people who contributed, many of the people who contributed. There's this cabinet which talks a little bit about the origins of the tree, where it came from. And then you enter in, it's built in this kind of forced Bernini-like perspective. So you enter into the space, and it's like being Alice through the rabbit hole. You're in a space which is the scale of it, the perspective of it is very different. It's a piece that really affects all of your senses. So the quality of the air is different. The sound is different in there. The smells, of course, are really different when you walk into that space. And there's the tree, not so much as a museum exhibit. It is on a pedestal, but there's no glass between you and it. It's very easy to touch, and all of the things that it takes to make this tree do what it does, which includes the glass, which has been colored to represent the spectrum of light that you get at the bottom of the forest. So that spectrum recapitulates the light under the canopy. It has a rain harvest system. There are these coolers, and being in this is a little bit like being in the belly of a whale. It's like being in a live organism. As the temperature gets hotter, things begin to move. The shutters open. The shades come down, and the building is constantly living to maintain the tree itself. This is not a kind of feel-good, huggy environmental work. This is really a little bit like being in a morgue. And it has very much the vernacular of that kind of space. The tree is massive. It's about 160 years old. There's also tiles I produce with local illustrators that show not only the things that are on and around the tree, but also some of the things that are missing. So we don't have, for instance, woodpeckers. We don't have chipmunks there. So those are represented in some other way. And of course, we also produce for them a field guide to the creatures in the vivarium itself. And there you see it in its very strange relationship in the park on Broad Street with the Space Needle in the back, the pavilion with and then with this Roxy Payne stainless steel tree in front of that, and then this Michael Heitzer on the other side of the road. I think it's a really exciting park to visit. And I worked a lot with the landscape designers Manfredi and Weiss. This is the city of Folkestone in England. It's a city on the Channel. It's a beautiful seaside town. It's one of those faded Edwardian seaside towns, and Folkestone has always had a very strong local population that have a close relationship to the sea. There's lots of tourists who come to enjoy Folkestone. You can see in the background, sort of beyond that thing, is the white cliffs of Dover. You can see France on a good day. Folkestone has, like many seaside towns, an enormous population of gulls. And the gulls, people love the gulls and hate the gulls. A lot of people hate the gulls. A lot of people love the gulls too much, and they teach the gulls bad manners by feeding them their fish and chips, and by feeding them the crisps and things like that. And so the gulls have picked up these bad habits. If you walk out of a takeaway shop in Folkestone with your fish and chips or with your sandwich, the gulls will come by you at 70 miles an hour, knock it out of your hands onto the ground, and then they'll all come and eat that. So people don't like the gulls, but I think the gulls are really amazing, and what the gulls really need is better PR. And so I thought what we would do, this is the Mobile Gull Appreciation Unit, and this travels around the city of Folkestone with a team of gull enthusiasts who, with evangelical fervor, try to go and convince the people of Folkestone that to know the gulls is to love the gulls. And gulls are one of the animals that are the most studied in ethology. So it's really possible to not so much speak gull, but to understand gull. Like I don't speak German, but I understand a lot of German. I can understand a lot of gulls by reading these books on gull behavior. Gulls have been studied for so long, and so we know a lot about what they're doing. Okay, that was the end of part 3. I'm only going to give you one example of part 4 because I hope that you will participate very much in the Oakland Museum project that I'm doing. Part 4 is related to, I work a lot with museums which have very diverse collections, with universal museums, and also with universities that have collections. Sometimes they know that they have collections, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are informal collections, things that got caught in the back of the closet. This is a project I did called the Bureau of the Study of Surrealism and Its Legacy, and this Bureau of the Center of the Study of Surrealism and Its Legacy, this was done at the University of Manchester, which is a great university in England, and a university which has a very proud tradition, and which, for some reason, the material culture of that university, some people in the university structure believe should be thrown away, and that all of the great oak desks should be stripped out and replaced with Formica ones. The wood paneling should be stripped down and replaced with plasterboard, and things like that. And I worked with the Manchester Museum, which is a museum of ethnography, of archaeology and Egyptology, of mineralogy, and natural history, and coins and stamps. And I was very interested that they were going through this process of cleaning the museum, tightening the museum, and things that really didn't fit into the museum categories, kind of orphaned things that no longer fit into the goals of the museum, would often either be thrown away or they would be put into the background and not really used in the collections. So I was very interested in the surrealists' interest in ethnography museums, in natural history museums, in a kind of archaic sense of putting things together. So I created the piece in which you view it through this partition, although members of the staff can not only go in, but have their meetings here. So they become part of the Surrealist Bureau. And inside of this are largely collections of things that that no longer fit into the museum categories. So maybe we'll never see the light of day again. But it's become a kind of permanent installation. For instance, there are these beautiful botanical models that used to use to teach botany in the 19th century. They're made of paper mache and wax and metal and they're just, and plaster, and they're just these kind of extraordinary things, but no one would ever use those to teach botany. and no one would use them to talk about botany anymore, so they languish in the background. And I was very interested in the kind of categories of things that surrealists were interested in fakes, in forgeries, in hybrids, in things that have a magical tradition, like the, what's the name of that root? The mandrake root, or the duckbill platypus, or the clock that has always been on the desk of the director. And also interested, of course, in surrealism as this moment of the understanding of the unconscious, of the moment that what surrealists believe was a revolutionary moment in which an understanding of the unconsciousness would change society dramatically for the better for all time, and also Freud's collections. So the Bureau has also a phone, and we printed business cards and left them in lots of clubs and pubs and things like that. And so you can call the phone and leave a message, and people do leave absolutely strange messages, and some people very, very desperate to find out what is the Center for the Study of Surrealism and its legacy. There's a six-legged hamster, and I don't think you're going to see that anywhere else. And another aspect of this was a wallpaper that we produced. So we produced a wallpaper. Manchester, of course, was a center of the textile trade, but also a center of design and a center of wall coverings. So we produced in the kind of tradition of Manchester wallpapers, wallpaper, but we included as our motifs 8 of the 10 official Rorschach ink blots, as well as integrating into it the monograms of the Surrealists and Dadaists, and some elements from Picabbia's cogs and wheels and things like that. So it's actually a really wonderful wallpaper. So that's my last image. And I just want to say in conclusion, if this is kind of work that is exciting and interesting to you, I want to put a plug in for the artist residency that Morgan Pewitt and I run in Pennsylvania called Mildred's Lane, and I think you can find out information about that from Morgan or myself, which very much promotes this kind of approach to art making. So thank you.